There are nights that begin with music, laughter, and a sense of release, and yet end in silence so complete it feels unnatural. One invitation, one decision to stay a little longer can fracture the timeline of a life forever. This is not just a disappearance. It is an absence that has resisted explanation for over a decade, lingering like an unanswered question. On August 22, 2009, a woman stepped into a world of flashing lights and late-night conversations, unaware she would never return home. There was no warning, no visible threat, no clear beginning of danger. Yet something shifted beneath the surface, quietly transforming an ordinary night into the opening of a mystery that would resist explanation for years. This is the story of Toni Sharpless, a 29-year-old mother who vanished after an after-party in Pennsylvania. There is no body, no confirmed crime scene, and no definitive answer. Cases like this linger in the spaces between facts, forcing us to confront fear not of what we see, but what we may never truly understand. And as you listen, consider how fragile normalcy can be. How easily a routine evening can become the last known moment of someone's life. If you find this exploration meaningful, remember to like, share, and subscribe, because these stories depend on attention to remain alive in collective memory. Pennsylvania is not a place most people associate with disappearance. It is a landscape of suburban calm, tree-lined streets and predictable routines where life feels manageable. In towns like Westchester, people work, return home, raise families, and repeat. Stability becomes expected. Danger feels distant, almost theoretical, as routine quietly reinforces the belief that nothing catastrophic will happen without warning or visible signs. But beneath that calm surface, human complexity remains unchanged. Emotional struggles, hidden conflicts, and private tensions exist even in the safest communities. On the night Toni disappeared, nothing suggested finality. There were no disruptions, no threats, only an ordinary evening. That is what makes it unsettling. The shift from normal life to irreversible absence happened silently, without any clear boundary or warning. Toni Sharpless was, by most accounts, someone who embodied both strength and vulnerability. She was a nurse, a profession that requires emotional resilience, discipline, and compassion. She was also a mother, raising a young daughter as a single parent, navigating responsibilities that rarely allow for rest. Those who knew her described her as intelligent and self-aware, someone capable of deep reflection. But they also noted a certain emotional sensitivity, a tendency to feel things intensely. This duality is not uncommon. In fact, it often exists in individuals who carry both responsibility and internal struggle at the same time. Toni had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, a condition that can alter perception, mood, and decision-making. However, in the period leading up to her disappearance, there were signs that she was stabilizing. Treatment appeared to be working. Life was beginning to regain structure, but stability in such conditions is rarely absolute. It exists on a spectrum, influenced by stress, environment, and circumstance. A crowded party, alcohol, emotional tension, or unexpected conflict can disrupt that balance. Not dramatically, but enough to shift behavior in ways that others may not immediately recognize. That night, Toni made a simple decision. She asked her family to watch her daughter so she could go out. It was not reckless. It was not unusual. It was, in many ways, an attempt to reclaim a part of herself that had been overshadowed by responsibility. A brief escape into normal adult social life. She went out with a friend, someone she trusted, someone who would later become the last known person to see her. Together, they entered a space filled with music and energy, a nightclub in Philadelphia where anonymity and connection coexist in fleeting moments. It was the kind of place where decisions are made quickly. At some point during the night, they were invited to an after-party hosted by Willie Green. The invitation itself did not seem unusual, as these transitions are common in social settings. However, what matters is not the invitation, but the shift that followed once it was accepted. Inside that private space, the atmosphere changed, becoming more confined, unpredictable, and shaped by individual behavior. Those present later offered accounts that did not fully align. Some details overlapped, while others contradicted each other in subtle but important ways. Memory, especially under stress or alcohol, reconstructs rather than preserves. Within those inconsistencies lies a deeper signal, suggesting the night may not have unfolded as smoothly as it first appeared, hinting at tension, discomfort, or instability. Toni was last seen leaving that environment in the early hours of the morning. She got into her vehicle and drove away alone. There were no confirmed signs of distress at that exact moment, no visible coercion, no immediate evidence of danger, just a departure that seemed on the surface entirely voluntary. But departures can be deceptive. The decision to leave may reflect clarity, or it may reflect urgency, confusion, or emotional overwhelm. Without context, the act itself reveals very little. And in Toni's case, that lack of context would become one of the most persistent obstacles in understanding what happened next. Back in Westchester, her family had no reason to worry that night, as everything followed a familiar pattern and she had gone out before with responsibilities waiting at home. Communities like hers rely on predictability, on the belief that people return and routines hold. When that expectation breaks, absence becomes more than personal, disrupting not just a life, but the entire sense of order. And that is where the story shifts from narrative to investigation, as a disappearance without trace forces attention inward toward relationships, decisions, and hidden behavioral layers only visible in hindsight. At that moment, there were no answers, only an abruptly ending timeline and a growing silence, expanding with questions while no one knew that within hours Toni Sharpless would vanish without a trace. The final hours of a person's life rarely announce themselves as significant. They unfold with the same casual rhythm as any other evening, shaped by small decisions that feel inconsequential at the time. For Toni Lee Sharpless, August 22nd, 2009 began not as an ending but as a temporary escape from routine, responsibility, and internal pressure. That evening, Toni made arrangements that reflected trust and intention. She asked her family to care for her young daughter, creating space for a night out. This was not abandonment, but balance, a moment carved out for herself. In psychological terms, such decisions often signal a need for relief rather than risk, a controlled departure from structured daily roles. She met with her friend Crystal, someone familiar, someone who existed within her trusted social circle. Together, they traveled into Philadelphia, a city that offered anonymity and stimulation. The nightclub they entered was filled with movement and sound, a sensory environment where identity becomes fluid and where emotional states can shift rapidly without external notice. Inside that space, the atmosphere was typical of late-night urban culture. Music pulsed through confined air. Conversations overlapped, and alcohol blurred the edges of perception. Nothing about the setting suggested danger. In fact, it encouraged a kind of temporary detachment, where individuals move between interactions, without fully anchoring to any one moment. At some point during the night, an invitation was extended. A transition from public space to private gathering. The host was Willie Green, a recognizable figure whose presence may have added a sense of legitimacy to the invitation. Toni and Crystal accepted, stepping into a different environment with different social dynamics. Private gatherings carry a different psychological weight than public venues. They are less regulated, more dependent on the behavior of individuals within them. Boundaries become less defined. The shift from a crowded nightclub to a private residence introduces variables that are harder to observe and even harder to reconstruct after the fact. Reports from those present at the after-party suggest a crowded, loosely structured environment. People moved freely, conversations overlapped, and substances may have been present. In such settings, perception becomes fragmented, memory becomes selective. What one person experiences as normal, another may perceive as uncomfortable or overwhelming. It is within this environment that Toni's behavior begins to draw attention, though not in a way that immediately signals danger. Some accounts suggest she became uneasy, others imply tension between her and Crystal. These details remain inconsistent, but they point toward a shift, a subtle change in emotional equilibrium. Conflict, even minor, can intensify in unfamiliar environments, especially under the influence of alcohol or stress, triggering a desire to withdraw and regain control. For someone managing bipolar disorder, such moments may carry deeper psychological weight. Around 4 to 5 in the morning, Toni chose to leave, marking her last confirmed act of autonomy, stepping away from a situation that may have felt increasingly unstable. She walked out to her vehicle, a Cadillac Escalade, and prepared to drive. There were no confirmed reports of anyone accompanying her. No evidence of coercion, no visible interruption, just a solitary departure into the early morning hours when the city begins to quiet and visibility, both literal and figurative, begins to diminish. The timing matters. Early morning hours reduce witnesses, quiet streets, and limit surveillance effectiveness, making deviations harder to detect or later reconstruct. At that moment, Toni was alone, and her mental state remains unclear. Some reports suggest stress or disorientation, while others describe a calm departure. This ambiguity reflects how perception is shaped by context, bias, and emotional involvement. What is certain is that once she drove away, the timeline dissolves. There are no verified sightings, no continuous trail, no logical sequence leading to an outcome. Instead, there is a gap filled with possibilities. Back home, concern grew as time passed. Calls went unanswered, and silence replaced expectation, marking the first clear sign that something had gone wrong. Her family's reaction followed a familiar psychological pattern, moving from uncertainty to anxiety, then urgency. When expected, communication fails. The mind begins to generate scenarios, often starting with harmless explanations before shifting toward more serious possibilities. As time passes without answers, those imagined outcomes grow darker, intensifying emotional distress and reinforcing the sense that something is deeply wrong. Friends were contacted, but no one had answers. Crystal, the last person known to see, Toni could only describe events up to her departure. Beyond that point, the narrative simply ended. There was no continuation, no resolution, only a shared awareness that something had interrupted the expected sequence, leaving a gap that no one could fill or explain. Law enforcement was eventually involved, marking a critical transition from concern to investigation. The early search lacked direction, with no confirmed route or physical trace to follow. As authorities questioned those at the party, inconsistencies emerged. Some described Toni as calm, others unsettled, reflecting either perception differences or fragmented memory, complicating efforts to reconstruct her final known state. There were unconfirmed suggestions that Toni may have intended to meet someone else after leaving. Whether this reflects reality or speculation remains unclear, but it adds complexity. Each possibility expands the range of interactions beyond the known circle, making the timeline harder to define and increasing uncertainty around her final movements and potential encounters that night. More concerning were signs that not everyone was fully cooperative. Hesitation, incomplete statements, and vague recollections can stem from fear or confusion. However, in investigations, such behavior often raises suspicion. It introduces the possibility that information is being withheld, whether intentionally or not, complicating efforts to reconstruct events with clarity and confidence. A detail then emerged that shifted the tone of the case. Reports mentioned a possible phone call after Toni left the party. Its content and authenticity remain uncertain, but its existence suggests her timeline may have continued beyond what was first believed, raising new questions about where she went and who she may have contacted afterward. Adding to the uncertainty, a later account claimed Toni's vehicle had been seen elsewhere, though this was never verified. Despite these fragments, no physical evidence was found. Her phone and vehicle remain missing, with no surveillance or forensic trace. Each missing piece deepened the mystery, leaving investigators facing not clarity but growing complexity. When the initial shock of disappearance settles, investigation begins to impose structure on uncertainty. In the case of Toni Lee Sharpless, that structure formed quickly but without foundation. Authorities returned to the last known location, the after-party, attempting to reconstruct a sequence that had already begun to fragment in memory. Investigators canvassed the area surrounding the residence, searching for any physical trace that might anchor the timeline. Tire marks, discarded items, surveillance fragments, anything that could establish direction. But the environment yielded nothing definitive. It was as if Toni had exited the observable world the moment she drove away, leaving no measurable imprint. Behind, attention then shifted to the possible routes she might have taken. Roads leading out of Philadelphia were examined, intersections considered, traffic patterns reviewed. Yet without a confirmed destination, these efforts became speculative. Each possible path branched into multiple outcomes, none supported by evidence, all equally plausible within the absence of constraint. Those present at the party became central to the investigation. Interviews were conducted, statements collected, timelines compared. But consistency proved elusive. Human memory, especially under the influence of alcohol and social chaos, tends to reconstruct rather than record. Details shifted. Emphasis changed. What remained was not a clear narrative, but overlapping fragments. No signs of a vehicular accident were discovered along any likely route. No damaged infrastructure. No reports from emergency services. No abandoned vehicle. This absence is significant. Accidents, even minor ones, tend to leave traces. Their complete lack suggested either an event occurring outside expected pathways or a scenario that avoided detection entirely. In complex cases, what is missing often becomes as important as what is found. Here, several potential leads appear to have dissipated before they could be fully pursued. Whether due to limited resources, initial assumptions, or the inherent difficulty of the case, certain avenues were not developed into conclusive lines of inquiry. As the investigation continued without resolution, media attention began to grow. Local news outlets picked up the story, framing it as a mysterious disappearance involving a young mother. The narrative spread quickly, not because of sensational details, but because of the absence of them. People are drawn to what cannot be explained. Toni's family became increasingly visible, appealing publicly for information. Their presence brought a human weight no statistics could capture. They were not analyzing probabilities, but confronting absence. Each day without answers intensified emotional strain, turning uncertainty into a prolonged psychological burden that reshaped their daily reality and deepened the urgency behind every unanswered question they faced. Public discourse soon filled the void left by missing evidence. Some proposed an accident, others a voluntary disappearance, while many suspected foul play. These theories reflected not only curiosity, but a deep need for closure. The human mind resists unresolved narratives, often constructing explanations even when no confirmation exists, in order to restore a sense of meaning and control. Online platforms amplified speculation, where fragments of information were shared and reshaped repeatedly. Details were sometimes distorted or taken out of context. Meanwhile, suspicion focused on those last seen with Toni. Inconsistencies in their statements drew attention, raising questions about whether these differences reflected flawed memory, stress, or the possibility of withheld information. Despite these concerns, no direct evidence ever emerged to implicate any specific individual. There were no forensic links, no reliable witness accounts, and no material traces strong enough to support a formal accusation. As a result, law enforcement could not identify an official suspect, leaving the case open but without a clear investigative direction or defined target to pursue. Another dimension of the case involved Toni's mental health. Her diagnosis of bipolar disorder was considered not as a conclusion, but as a variable. Investigators questioned whether her psychological state could have influenced her actions that night, potentially contributing to her disappearance without external involvement, adding complexity to an already uncertain and incomplete narrative. There were suggestions that Toni may have been under emotional strain, balancing motherhood, professional demands, and ongoing treatment. Such pressure can shape decisions in subtle ways. However, there is no evidence she intended to disappear. No preparation, no planning, no indication of departure, making the idea of voluntary disappearance difficult to support based on known facts. Years after the initial investigation, a new element emerged when an individual claimed indirect knowledge of what might have happened. According to this account, Toni may have been involved in an accident that was concealed rather than reported. Though unverified, this claim shifted the narrative, suggesting not only an event, but a reaction shaped by pressure and fear. From a psychological perspective, such reactions often stem from immediate fear of consequences. Legal risk, social judgment, and personal loss can override rational thinking, leading to concealment instead of accountability. In high-stress moments, individuals may act impulsively, prioritizing self-preservation and later reinforcing those decisions through silence, denial, or selective memory over time. Yet the credibility of this account remains uncertain. Without corroborating evidence, it exists between possibility and speculation. It cannot be confirmed, but neither can it be fully dismissed. Instead, it becomes another fragment, adding weight to the unresolved nature of the case while offering no definitive clarity or direction for investigators to follow. What makes this development significant is its implication. It suggests the truth may still exist, hidden within memory or silence. The case shifts from investigation to interpretation, where meaning must be drawn from limited facts. As each theory adds complexity, the narrative becomes less clear, revealing how human behavior under pressure can obscure rather than reveal truth. A woman disappears into the early morning darkness, leaving behind no trace, no confirmed event, no definitive explanation. What remains is not a story with an ending, but a space filled with competing interpretations. Each theory attempts to impose order on absence, yet each carries its own fractures, revealing as much about human reasoning as the case itself. In the absence of evidence, the mind constructs narratives. It searches for intention, for cause, for meaning. But when those elements cannot be verified, they become reflections of our own assumptions. The case of Toni Sharpless exists in this uncertain territory, where logic and speculation overlap without resolution. The first prevailing theory centers on the possibility of conflict leading to foul play. Within the environment of the after-party, subtle tensions may have escalated. Disagreements, misunderstandings, or perceived threats could have triggered a chain of events that moved beyond control, resulting in harm that was never reported or acknowledged. This theory draws strength from inconsistencies in witness accounts, variations in how Toni's behavior was described, shifts in tone, and incomplete recollections suggest that the environment may not have been as stable as initially assumed. When narratives diverge, it often indicates that individuals experienced the same moment in fundamentally different ways. From a psychological perspective, group environments can suppress individual accountability. If something unexpected occurs, responsibility becomes diffused. Each person assumes someone else will act, or that silence is the safest response. In such contexts, even significant events can be collectively minimized or obscured through inaction. However, this theory faces a critical limitation. There is no physical evidence supporting it. No signs of struggle, no confirmed location of harm, no forensic trace linking any individual to a violent outcome. Without these elements, the theory remains plausible, but unsubstantiated, suspended, between suspicion and proof. The second theory approaches the case from a different angle. It suggests that Toni's disappearance may have originated not from conflict, but from accident. Leaving the party alone, possibly in a distressed or distracted state, she may have encountered a situation on the road that resulted in unintended consequences. In this scenario, the absence of evidence is interpreted differently. Instead of concealment within a social environment, it suggests an event occurring outside the immediate awareness of others. A vehicle leaving the roadway, an isolated area, a moment where visibility and response were limited. Such incidents can remain undiscovered for extended periods. The concept of a cover-up emerges when considering the human response to accidental harm. If another party became aware of the incident, fear could override responsibility. The anticipation of legal consequences, social judgment, or personal loss can lead individuals to make decisions that prioritize self-preservation over truth. This interpretation gains some support from the later testimony of an unverified witness who suggested that an accident may have occurred and was subsequently concealed. While this account lacks confirmation, it aligns with known behavioral patterns. Under pressure, individuals may rationalize concealment as a temporary solution, which then becomes permanent. Yet this theory also encounters significant challenges. The complete absence of Toni's vehicle remains unexplained. In most accident scenarios, some form of physical evidence eventually emerges. The lack of such discovery raises questions about whether this explanation fully accounts for all aspects of the case. When comparing these theories, it becomes clear that each relies on different assumptions. The first emphasizes interpersonal dynamics and potential escalation. The second focuses on isolation and unintended consequence. Both attempt to interpret the same absence but through distinct psychological frameworks that do not converge. The question remains, not as a demand for certainty, but as an invitation to reflect. Which theory aligns more closely with the available fragments? Which interpretation accounts for both what is present and what is missing? And perhaps more importantly, what does that choice reveal about how we understand human behavior? From a psychological standpoint, concealment, whether following intentional harm or accidental involvement, often shares common characteristics. It is rarely premeditated. Instead, it emerges in moments of acute stress, where cognitive processing narrows and decisions are made rapidly, guided more by fear than by rational evaluation. In such states, individuals may underestimate long-term consequences while overestimating immediate threats. This imbalance leads to actions that appear illogical in hindsight yet felt necessary in the moment. Silence becomes a strategy, avoidance becomes a pattern, and over time these responses solidify into sustained secrecy. At the same time, Toni's own psychological state must be considered. Managing bipolar disorder involves navigating fluctuations in perception and emotion. Even during periods of stability, external stimuli can influence internal balance, affecting judgment in subtle but meaningful ways. Environments like late-night gatherings amplify these effects. Sensory overload, social pressure, and substance exposure can alter decision-making processes. For someone already managing internal variability, such conditions may increase vulnerability, not necessarily to external harm, but to unpredictable shifts in behavior. Beyond psychology, the case invites philosophical reflection. Western thought often frames human nature as a balance between rationality and impulse. Under ordinary conditions, structure prevails, but in moments of disruption, impulse can dominate, leading to actions that diverge sharply from established identity. From a Buddhist perspective, the concept of impermanence offers a different lens. Life is understood as inherently unstable, subject to sudden change. A single moment, a single decision, can alter the course of existence. Not as punishment, but as consequence, shaped by conditions that converge without warning. In this sense, the disappearance is not only an event, but a reflection of how fragile continuity truly is. The expectation that life will proceed as planned is often an illusion. What remains after disruption is not certainty, but the need to reconcile with uncertainty, to accept that some narratives resist completion. More than a decade has passed, and still the story of Toni Lee Sharpless remains unresolved. There is no confirmed conclusion, no definitive explanation, only a family that continues to wait and a community that continues to question what happened that night. Perhaps the truth exists, held within memory, silence, or fear. Or perhaps it has been lost to time, inaccessible despite continued effort. What is certain is that this case does not end. It persists, not through evidence but through absence, through the space where answers should be but are not. Some crimes leave no visible trace, only unanswered questions. And some silences resonate, more deeply than any confession ever could. Thank you for listening to Criminal Mindcast.